Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome all of you for the Special Economic Forum 2017 organized by the International Institute of Knowledge Management together with University of Sri Jayewardenepura, Sri Lanka, in line with the first International Conference on Economics and Development. So ladies and gentlemen, today you are here to discuss and talk with each other, to exchange your insights and ideas about a timely topic, which is economic and development. As we all know, economic development and economic growth are two separate aspects, but still they are used so interchangeably. So when it comes to economic development and economic growth, those are two aspects or topics that is mostly touched by the governments, the politicians, and even the general public in any country. So it is a must to say that this gathering is enriched with a very different participants from different societies, different nations. To be specific, we have participants coming from 11 countries, and to the crowd exactly goes to around 75 plus, representing 11 countries in this world. So what we, the organizing committee, thought was getting ideas from nationalities all around the world with regard to this economics and development or economic growth is a very vital thing to be happened in a time like this, especially to the Sri Lankan aspect. This is really important. So that is why, with this prime objective, the Economic Forum is organized today in line with the first international conference on economics and development. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I use this opportunity to welcome Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha, the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and also Dr. Dayan Jayatilleka, former Sri Lankan Ambassador, former Permanent Representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations in Geneva, and also Mr.E.A.Rathnaseela, Director of Department of Public Finance, Ministry of Finance, Sri Lanka, and also Mr. Ralph Van Doorn, Senior Country Economist for Sri Lanka and Maldives World Bank, and also Mr. Anushka Wijesinha, the Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Sri Lanka. They will be gracing this special occasion as the distinguished panelists of the day. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I use this opportunity to welcome all of them with lots of love, honor, and gratitude. And also I would like to welcome the moderator of this forum, Mr. Aponso, the Senior Lecturer of Economics of University of Colombo, who has come accepting our invitation to grace this occasion. And not to be forgotten, we also welcome all the invitees who have accepted our generous invitation that was forwarded to them to grace this occasion. On behalf of the organizing committee, I welcome all of you to this great gathering as well, representing several corporate associations and academic bodies in Sri Lanka. And also, I use this opportunity to welcome all the participants of the conference, plus the non-participants who have come specially for this forum, Economic Forum 2017. And also, not to be forgotten, I welcome all the media personalities representing several media organizations in Sri Lanka who have come to cover up this event on behalf of their media organization. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, let me welcome all of you for this great gathering. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving on to the day's procedure. And let me begin like this. I'm now going to invite the moderator of this forum, Mr. Aponso, the Senior Lecturer of Economics, University of Colombo. And let me give a brief introduction about this great gentleman. Mr. Indrajit, who calls himself an unorthodox passionate learner of economics, holds multidisciplinary qualifications. He had his first degree in mathematics and chemistry at the University of Colombo, before he embarked on a path to economics. He obtained a master's in economics from the University of Colombo and later obtained a master's in philosophy in financial economics from the University of Hong Kong. His professional career begins as a manager with a private conglomerate 8 Conspens and then proceeded to become and Assistant Director at the Sri Lanka Export Development Board before he assumed working at the University of Colombo during his full-time study of the Masters in Economics think tank in Sri Lanka. So if I go to read out his full biography, that goes on. And today he has become one of the favorite people who love economics in Sri Lanka, and we can see that he has a lot of students who love to learn from him, especially the economics and development. So, Mr. Wijesinha, Senior Lecturer of Economics, University of Colombo, I invite you to take up the further proceedings of the Special Economic Forum 2017.
All of you, I can see it's a very colorful audience, and we have a very diverse, colorful panel of presenters today to answer issues. Inclusive economic growth, rethinking the development process in a time of paradigm shift. Before I go on to any further explanations, let me just first invite the panelists to the stage. Let me start from Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha, Deputy Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Please, Nande. And next I invite Dr. Dayan Jayatilleka, former Sri Lankan ambassador, former permanent representative of Sri Lanka to the United Nations. Dayan. I was asked to sit and talk, but I said I'm not used to doing that. And let me next invite Ralph van Doorn from the World Bank. He's the senior country economist for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Ralph. Then I met one of my old friends, Mr.E.A.Rathnaseela, Director from the Department of Public Finance, Minister of Finance. And last but not least, our very famous young budding economist, I won't call him budding economist, he's a very famous economist now, and a role model for most of you undergraduates, Anushka Wijesinha. No conference without Anushka is a conference. Now I have the honor and the responsibility of introducing the panelists. Let me start from Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha. Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha was promoted to the position of Deputy Governor in 2011, and now he is, since then he has been taking this major responsibility. He has a PhD and a master's degree in economics from Australian National University and BSc from University of Ceylon. Dr. Weerasingha is the chairman of the Monetary Policy Committee and Foreign Reserve Management Committee of the Central Bank. He currently functions as the Deputy Governor supervising the Department of Economics, Research, Statistics, International Operations, Domestic Operations, Macroprudential Surveillance, the whole list of things. Bear with me, Nande, I won't go all that way. And he's a visiting lecturer in Master's Economics courses at the University of Colombo and a research economist at the Ceylon Center, Malaysia, and also a visiting research fellow, Australian National University. He's an advisory member, board member of the Center of Applied Macroeconomics Analysis. He has a lot of credentials that goes on. Then comes our fiery Dr. Dayan Jayatilleka. Dayan, of course, everybody knows on different contexts as well, because he has been very much a television figure as well. Dayan Jayatilleka, PhD, a former Sri Lankan ambassador, an academic and an author of several books, and prominent analyst, commentator in the media. Until 2013, he served as Sri Lanka's ambassador to extraordinary potential of France, Portugal, and Spain, permanent delegate to the UNESCO. And Dayan was a visiting lecturer, senior research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University of Singapore. And he was the editor of Lanka Guardian magazine. And he was the youngest minister, very important thing in today's context. In the provincial council systems at the time, he held a portfolio of planning and youth affairs in the Northeast Provincial Council of Sri Lanka. Dayan Jayatilleka graduated with the first class honors in political science from University of Peradeniya and received a Fulbright scholarship in 1982-83. He holds an MPhil from the University of Colombo, PhD from Griffith University, Brisbane. And he has many publications under his belt. Next I move on to Ralph. Ralph is the World Bank Senior Country Economist for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. He focuses on analyzing macroeconomic developments and the drivers of growth and providing technical assistance to the government with specific focus on fiscal policy, public debt management. Previously at the European and Central Asian Studies. Before joining the World Bank, he worked at the Credit Suisse in London, analyzing developments in Egypt and many other countries, Gulf countries, for example. He has published analysis on the impact of global financial crisis. And he has a Master's of Science in Applied Physics from Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. Then I come to Mr.E.A.Rathnaseela. E.A.Rathnaseela is the Director, Department of Public Finance. And he has a MA in Policy Economics, Williams College, Massachusetts, USA, Postgraduate Diploma in Economic Development, University of Colombo, Postgraduate Diploma in Development Studies, IDE Advanced School of Economics, Japan, Bachelor of Science, Biology, University of Rona. He's Assistant Director and then became a Deputy Director, and now he's a Director, then he has been the Director National Planning. So he holds a number of responsibilities under his belt. Now I come to our very famous economist, young economist, Anushka Wijesinha, Chief Economist, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Anushka is an economist with a track record of research and advisory work across Asia. He has published in national and international publications, focusing on innovation, private sector development, and international economics. He is currently the Chief Economist of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Head of the Economics Intelligence Unit. He serves in a number of boards, private sector, and he is also involved in many organizations and bodies. Anushka holds a Master's in Economics and Development from University of Leeds, Business School, UK, BSc Economics from University of College London, and he was recognized the Ceylon magazine's 40 under 40 list of influential young Sri Lankans in 2013 and 2014. So Anushka is the curator of the Global Shapers Colombo Hub. Okay, now those profiles, you can see we have a very elegant, very eminent panel of speakers today. Now, to get on with the subject, the structure will be each panelist will be given 5 minutes of presentation, and then we get on to the discussion straight away as a Q&A session. So, to begin with, let me invite Dr. Nandalal to make a brief presentation on the subject.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this important occasion. And also, let me say I'm a central banker. Here, the views I express is not necessarily relating to the central bank, because as you know, central bank in business is all about, especially when it comes to my responsibilities, economic and price stability, monetary policy, reserve management. This has nothing much to, although related, nothing much to do with the inclusive growth and the how you address the poverty, inequality, and all these the issues. So my views as an economist, let me share a few thoughts in Sri Lanka's context. any developing country or in country, you would see unequal growth, inequity in the economic distribution in terms of large, portion of population have really high economic benefits, high incomes, and also much larger portion of population are relatively low income groups. So that is obviously what we call the reason for us to promote inclusive growth when country experiences large amount of population under either below poverty or just above the poverty. So in Sri Lankan situation, although we say our level of poverty in terms of some of the indicators is about only 6.7%, but if you look at the in different indicators, different measurements, I would say about more than 25% or even larger population is still are relatively low income groups. So if you look at the distribution of those income groups, we have there are distribution in terms of regions and in terms of several levels of in terms of the sectors of the economy, like agriculture, services and industry. For example, if you look at within Sri Lanka, there are certain areas where we have larger amount of population, below under poverty or close to on the poverty lines, like in the north and east mainly, and then Badulla, Mundragal, all these areas, and some part of Sumurali, and even within the western province there are some pockets of, some of the data that we have shows that even within the western province, within Colombo district, there are certain pockets that people live in below poverty. So if you think about why there's income disparities and people living under poverty, is basically there are few things. So first one, the access to, if you compare people in those regions, the access to health, access to education, and in opportunities for employment and also economic opportunities. Those are the key areas. If you analyze Sri Lankan situation, so large amount of population, those are low income, are mainly in the agriculture sector, which is about 30% of our population or workforce are employed in the agriculture sector. And out of those population, if you think, if you have to rethink how to get these people out of the poverty, and we need to have a kind of a new reforms in the agriculture sector, where this, if you look at 30% of workforce contributing to overall economy, only 7% of GDP. If you look at the agriculture sector, contributing only 7% of GDP, whereas 30% of the working workforce is employed in that sector. So then obviously you see a huge disparity here. So people who are employed in the agriculture sector obviously will have to have low incomes. So what are the reasons? Because of the very low productivity. And also the social safety net scheme that we are having right now would encourage those people to remain in that sector, because you have a lot of subsidies. The agriculture fertilizer subsidy, you have estate lands given at a low price, and very small cost of lands. They are not viable for commercial kind of the production of all the agricultural products, and the supply chains, very inefficient supply chains. So then they remain in those areas, and they ever live in very low income, unless we have a kind of reforms for them to come out of those agriculture and go into other different sectors like services and industries, where one can have a higher level of incomes and one can have better lifestyles. That's one area and what we need to encourage. And obviously one of the reasons why, in terms of health, education and all these facilities, the disparity also explain the areas where people would not have access to basic health, basic education, then they remain living under those conditions. So the as a point of government, as policymakers, the areas where we need to focus is mainly areas where you don't have access, and government responsibility is to improve those services and also create opportunities and help them improve their productivity and come out of this agriculture sector and have people who are doing agriculture need to have much higher incomes. Otherwise, they can't have good living conditions. So for that, they need to have better productivity and improvements, and then take that labor out of those areas and have a lot more opportunities in other areas. This is where the regional development in those areas and have a lot more other opportunities. And other second area I will stop here. Other thing what I want to highlight is if you look at total labor force, the female participation of labor force is only 30%. This is where the economic contribution or the living conditions and poverty, this can be eliminated if you can get female participation, more participation in the workforce. So that they are also we need a lot of reforms in terms of labor market reforms, in terms of their skill enhancement, in terms of the making them easier to come to the workforce. So there are a lot of reforms we have to do for us to utilize our female workforce to much more productive and high income opportunities. For that their living conditions can be. Those are the with the broad issues I'll start, and then obviously I can talk about the sectoral issues. So I'll stop here in 5 minutes, and then I'm happy to come back in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha. Let me just make a point here. There are, as I heard, there are 11 countries representing delegates in this forum, and there are large number of undergraduates and students who are learning economics are in this forum. So it will be a great opportunity for you to bring in your own country perspectives from the delegates who are representing different countries, and also from these young budding economists to look at things from their own perspective, which sometimes get missed out in this whole conversation. So these are some of the issues that we have. Let me, as we say, before I move on to the next speaker, sometimes we say that the definition of inclusive economic growth, it's been defined and redefined and rehashed. But nevertheless, if you ask 5 economists what it is all about, they'll have 6 answers. So that's a sort of challenge we have at the very beginning. But at the grassroots level, how to get things going, how to get the bus moving. Okay, so there is a lot of discussion that we should be expecting. Let me move on to another speaker, none other than Dayan Jayatilleka, Dr. Dayan Jayatilleka. Dayan has a very political perspective from coming from central bank, very monetary policy at a different level, but here it's a much more, I would say, much more aggressive aspect of that. I'm not saying it is Dayan's aggressiveness, but then the whole issue is the whole issue has. So over to Dayan.
Thank you, Dr. Aponsu. My experience in this field is, on the one hand, theoretical. One of my professors was Professor Emanuel Wallerstein, very well-known theoretician of world systems. But more practically, I was closely associated with the development presidency of President Premadasa. I was the Director of Conflict Studies at the Institute of Policy Studies during the Premadasa term. So I have absorbed the developmental thinking that informed the Premadasa presidency. That's where I'm coming from. Now, it is attributed to Albert Einstein the quote that the definition of lunacy is to keep doing the same thing and expect a different result. I would go one beyond that. Not only are we in Sri Lanka today doing the same thing that we did in the past but expecting a different result, we are going one better, which is to keep doing things worse but expect a better result. My point is that whether you look at things on the horizontal axis, that is globally, or the vertical axis in terms of time, that is Sri Lanka's development experience and the lessons of Sri Lanka's development experience. The model, the developmental model today, if developmental it is, ignores the lessons on both axes. It completely ignores the global lessons and the paradigm shift, the crisis of a certain global paradigm, of which we have plenty of evidence, including most recently the British elections. But it also ignores the developmental experience of Sri Lanka from 1947. The present administration, or the dominant elite within the present administration, is operating on the basis of a certain narrative. Now that narrative is a fairy tale. The narrative is that we had this great place in 1947, and then we blew it, and the implications are that we blew it around 1956, and now we have a chance of going back on a time machine and doing what we started doing immediately after independence. All we need is a new constitution and a new set of economic policies. Now, that is not the real story of Sri Lanka. The real story of Sri Lanka is that we've had two major civil wars in the south. We've had one long 30-year civil war in the north and east. And it has been the socio-economic policies that have been followed by certain administrations that triggered the two civil wars in the south, and the problems in the north have been exacerbated by the ultra-nationalism in the south, itself generated as a response to a certain socio-economic model. Therefore, during the Premadasa presidency, we shifted, not only due to his own thinking, but also due to the changed thinking in the world, to a model of growth with equity as the only model that could really develop the country and prevent socio-economic and ultra-nationalist backlashes. We have forgotten that. That's the real story. We have forgotten those lessons. If you look very briefly at our economic history, our developmental history, you would find that the government that was elected in 1952, a UNP government, looked at the figures as our policymakers are looking at now. And the governor of the central bank, John Exter, I believe it was at that time, said, look, this doesn't work, you have to cut the subsidies. And they cut the subsidies. Jayawardena was the finance minister. He learned a lesson that he never forgot. And the lesson was that there was a hartal, that is a huge, massive popular uprising. 8 people were shot dead. Women blocked the railways, baked hoppers on the rail tracks, and the government had to flee to a US ship docked outside Sri Lanka. I hope that it doesn't have to be repeated one of these days. And then, of course, you had the election in 56, by which time the ultra-nationalist surge had also taken place, because there was a cultural reaction against that government, and you had 1956 and its policies. Then again, you had the UNP administration in 1965-70. And the JVP grew during that period, though the insurrection took place under the SLP in 71. The JVP armed itself during the 65-70 period of the UNP, again as a result of a socio-economic model which caused tremendous inequity in the rural areas and generated much student unrest. Waves of student unrest and trade union struggle. So there was enormous radicalization. Then you had the open economy of President Jayawardena and the massive southern insurrection that resulted. Premadasa, who was a UNP, he was not communist or socialist, but he kept his ear to the ground and his finger on the pulse. And he articulated an economic doctrine that fitted with the new thinking, though he arrived at it quite independently and quite early, the new thinking which was coming out of even the World Bank, coming out of the UN agencies, the UNDP and so on. That is why you had the Wijesinha Commission on Poverty Alleviation, because Mr. Premadasa as Prime Minister could see the disparities that were growing. And you had, during his presidency, a policy, an inclusionary policy of growth with equity. Now, all of that has been abandoned today. What you have is a model that is not inclusive, that is in fact exclusionary, a model which is non-national, a model which is based on using our location and leasing for long periods of time or selling off our strategic national assets, such as the Trincomalee port. Inviting our neighbor to build roads in the north and east, to take over parts of the port, to take over part of the oil tank, to take over the oil tank farm, and signing an agreement called ETCA, which according to our Prime Minister is an invitation to the 5 southern states of India, including Tamil Nadu, to integrate our economy with theirs. The word integrate is the Prime Minister's, not mine. That's like integrating a sprat with a shark. There's only one way to integrate a sprat with a shark, and that's to be swallowed by the shark. So this is a model that is not inclusionary in a national sense, and it is not inclusionary in terms of the poorest of the poor, to use another term of President Premadasa, who said that the aim of development policy should be to make the have-nots into haves, Nati Bari into Ati Haki, as he said in Sinhala. Instead, you have a model that is being abandoned throughout the world because it is under siege. The model of neoliberal globalism, the model of indiscriminate opening up, of foreignization, of denationalization, the model of rampant privatization is under siege from 2 sources. One is the populist nationalist right, for instance in the United States, also the Brexit vote, and the other from the populist left. If you look at the manifesto of Jeremy Corbyn, for the many, not the few, you have promises to nationalize, you have promises to do away with tuition fees, promises to take back the public utilities, and so on and so forth, irrespective of the figures. And the people, because they are in pain, don't care whether the numbers add up. So the neoliberal globalizing paradigm is shifting now under pressure from the citizenry. But in Sri Lanka, the dominant economic policymakers do not seem to know that this shift is taking place. And therefore, that is why I said that whether it's horizontally in terms of what's happening globally or vertically in terms of the developmental experiences of Sri Lanka, at least from 1952, this administration is living in cloud cuckoo land. It will succeed only in doing what the same policies did every time we had them, to generate socio-economic unrest and to generate ethno-religious and ethno-national backlashes. That in turn will undermine economic stability and growth. My final point is that the political matrix, all economic development takes place in an institutional and political matrix. The political matrix is all wrong. The political matrix is one in which the people voted for a weak government, the UNP, with a 7-seat majority, and a strong opposition in August 2015, the SLFP with a 95-seat presence in the opposition. Instead, a section was hived off, plugged onto the government, but the remainder, which is the larger one, 52 members of parliament, is not recognized as the legitimate opposition. Instead, you have a 16-member TNA, which is named the opposition but does not play the role of the opposition. You do not have the lowest tier of the political system, the Pradeshia Sabha in operation, which is why you had such a delayed response and an insufficient response to the natural disaster that struck. And the government is violating one of the fundamental rules that was learned by leaders the world over after the collapse of the post-Soviet experiment. That is, never undertake drastic economic reform and political reform at the same time. Do one first, build up popularity and a strong support base, and then go in for the other. That's what the Chinese told the Russians. The Russians didn't listen, and then there was a collapse under Yeltsin, and now of course there's been a backlash and Putin has re-strengthened the Russian state. But here we are going in for a new constitution which is drastic political reform at a time when you're also going in for drastic economic reform, that is selling off parts of the country and privatizing the state and slashing public expenditure. It's a recipe for an explosion. It's never worked anywhere in the world. It will not work here. The advice given to him by Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz when he spoke here in 2015 with the Prime Minister on one panel, and he advised the Prime Minister, this is on the public record, some of you may have been there, he said, give first priority to the problem of inequity. Take care of your equity first. But I've listened very carefully to what the Finance Minister, the Prime Minister, and the Minister of Economic Development have had to say for 2.5 years. I haven't once heard the term equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayan. Well, let me just make a very quick addition to what Dan was saying, for the benefit of the friends, delegates who have come from other countries. He refers to the SLFP, which is the center-leftist government political party in Sri Lanka, then the UNP, which is the rightist political party in Sri Lanka. Then he referred to JVP, which is very much a radical socialistic base party in Sri Lanka. So these parties have made different impressions during the Sri Lanka's post-independence. Thank you, Dayan. Let me now invite Mr. Ralph to make his brief presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much. From the World Bank's perspective, Sri Lanka has been a development success story. We've seen very strong poverty reduction, a very strong increase in living standards, whether we look at it across time or across poverty measure, or when we look at it in the context of the South Asia region or even peer countries. So that's the good thing. It has been driven by strong growth post-war, in the years post-war. And that kind of begs the question, what drove growth? What drove poverty reduction? Maybe to link into discussion of Dr. Dayan, were these dividends from growth shared across the population? Did the government play a role in inclusive growth? And what can be done to continue inclusive growth in the future? So let's try to briefly try to address those questions, and maybe later in discussion we can go into more depth. So as everyone knows, growth post-war was driven by non-tradable sectors, construction, financial services, personal services. The share of exports to GDP has fallen over the last 2 decades from around imports and exports, so trade to GDP, from around 80% to around 20%, 25%, which is very low. Now, what does it tell us about sustainability? Well, first of all, tradable sectors have not been driving growth, and which can also be seen by the productivity gains have therefore not materialized from tradable sectors. Now, if you look at poverty reduction, what drove poverty reduction? Now, we look at it in a couple of episodes, 2002, 2009-10, and 2012-13, because we look at surveys conducted by the Department of Census and Statistics. So if you look from 2002 to 2012-13, we see a very strong decline in poverty, which, as I said, is really impressive. We also see that overall it has been pro-poor, meaning that the income or consumption of the poorest people in society grew more strongly than the income or consumption of the richest. That's good news. That means that inequality, which you can also measure by the so-called Gini coefficient, which many of you will know from your economics courses, the Gini coefficient of inequality fell overall. We can also see it in, as I said earlier, social indicators. But if you look at it in two episodes, 2002, 2009-10, and then 2009-10 to 2012-13, there are different episodes. While poverty reduction continued over both episodes, the last few years, so 2009-10 to 12-13, actually was not pro-poor. So whereas the first, the 2000s decade was pro-poor, the poorest income grew faster than the richest. In the last few years, the opposite happened. Between 2009-10 and 12-13, actually the richest consumption grew faster than that of the poorest. So inequality increased. Now, that also leaves the country with an unfinished agenda. So not only did, over the last few years, until a few years ago, inequality increased, we also see that pockets of poverty continue to exist. And we see difference in poverty rates across different religions and ethnicities, and also in different regions of the country and different economic sectors. Now, the question is, what drove then this poverty reduction? And you can think about two ways. One is income, the other one redistribution, what the government does. Now, in Sri Lanka, it was mainly income. The role of government in redistributing the dividends of growth actually was very limited. As you probably know, Samudra fell was basically inflated away. So what mainly drove poverty reduction was an increase in returns to labor, which is by itself good news. It means that if you have a job, in those years, you actually increase your income and you could actually escape poverty. Now, why did returns on income increase? And we have four hypotheses. One is agglomeration. We see a very strong agglomeration of urbanization of Sri Lanka, and typically urbanization and agglomeration is associated with more innovation, more production, and more exchange of ideas, increasing economies of scale, and generally more productivity, so higher wages. The second one is the structural change in the economy from a predominantly agricultural sector to a services and industrialized economy, which also happened over the last 1.5 decades. The third one is the increase in commodity prices that happened in the 2000s, and then after a break also a bit in the early 2010s. And then finally, a very strong push into post-war reconstruction. Now, then the question begs, are these sustainable sources of income increase? And we think that the first two, yes. I mean, agglomeration is something that is happening in Sri Lanka, and it will continue to happen, very likely. The structural transformation is continuing, but commodity prices have fallen, and so you cannot rely on purely on commodity prices alone. They're cyclical to provide an escape from poverty. And finally, domestic public investment-driven growth. That model has been probably is not sustainable. The fiscal resources are not sufficient to drive growth from that perspective. So out of the four reasons incomes grew, two of them may not work for much longer, and two of them probably will still continue. So you have to, think, okay, what can we do to sustain income growth and poverty reduction and inclusive growth? Now, you can ask yourself, what was the role of the government? There are basically if there are two roles, the private and the public sector in poverty reduction, it seems as if it was mainly returns to labor, and the role of the government in poverty reduction seems to have been very limited. That's through in direct sense. I said Samudra was not very generous in those years. Of course, in 2015 it was tripled, and that makes a big difference. So we generally see that actually the redistributional impact of fiscal policy in Sri Lanka is only moderately progressive, meaning the poor do benefit from cash transfers, but in fact the taxation negates a lot of those benefits. Most taxation is indirect, VAT and excises, which is kind of neutral, and in some cases could even be regressive, that the poor pay more relative to the income than the rich. And personal income tax, which can be very progressive and make sure that those who can bear the burden pay the most. It's very little, as you all know, in Sri Lanka. So that means that the redistributional impact of fiscal policy in Sri Lanka is very limited. It became better in 2015 with the tripling of Samudra, but still there's a lot of scope for making sure that fiscal policy benefits the poor more, and you have more equality. So what can then be done? And I tend to agree with parts of what the previous two speakers said. One of them is macroeconomic stability. Macroeconomic stability meaning a sustainable fiscal accounts and debt and low and stable inflation. That's actually, we'll have two channels. One is, it generally is beneficial to the poor who tend to hold more assets in cash, and therefore inflation would erode their assets away. So low inflation is generally good for the poor, but also it's good for business, and business creates jobs. And as if you cannot rely on the public sector to generate jobs and public investment in the near future, then the private sector has to generate them. Low and stable inflation, macro stability, is also good as a business for the business environment. Another thing is, look carefully at your tax system. The tax system is used to give untargeted subsidies to the non-poor, for example, to the VAT system and its exemptions, and change it to a targeted system to the poor. So don't use the tax system for those social purposes. Use the expenditure system for targeted expenditure, for example, strengthening social safety net, targeted public investment in areas where lots of poor people live, and channeling more money and improvements in the delivery of quality health, public health and education. And attract more FDI, and maybe there we maybe disagree, or maybe later we do agree. Attract more FDI. Your stable business environment you'll attract more, hopefully more foreign direct investment. Now, compared to domestic investment, and you need investment in a country where the demographics will dictate that your labor force will start falling about 10 years from now, you need to invest to sustain growth. And foreign direct investment has the benefit that it brings in a lot of global knowledge, managerial best practices. It generally will make workers more productive, and they'll earn higher wages. And again, you have another engine of inclusive growth. Now, there's several ways to attract more foreign direct investment, and if you have any question later, we can talk about what kind of reforms could be needed. And finally, maybe to address that question about the 11 countries that are present. I'm from the Netherlands. We're only 16 million people. We had a car industry and we built airplanes. Both industries died, but we're still assembling Teslas now. We didn't invent them, but we're assembling Teslas, and we're building wings for Airbus. And there was a grand drama when the car and the plane manufacturers they shut down. But small countries cannot build the whole product. You have to be part of a global value chain. You make what you're best at doing. In the case of the Netherlands, it's kind of small things, but the high-tech things. The same for Sri Lanka. You cannot compete with Bangladesh or India. You have higher wages, but you're also more productive. Your social indicators are better, your infrastructure is better. So there is a niche for Sri Lanka where it can enter global value chains and actually provide better jobs and more productive jobs. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Ralph. Now, so far, as you have seen, one from Central Bank, we are on the monetary policy and the macroeconomic stability, then come from Dayan, where the political perspectives, how he gets engaged in this whole discussion. Then comes from development agency, the World Bank, where they look at it more comparatively and looking at how Sri Lanka compares with other countries, and also what, from their perspective, what is required and missing. Now we turn to Mr. Rathnaseela. He's is from a perspective from the public sector, from the Minister of Policy Planning, and he will come the perspective from a bureaucratic perspective, from a bureaucrat, and also one who is engaging in the policy formulations. Over to Mr. Rathnaseela.
Thank you, sir. At the very outset, I also must mention that whatever the views expressed by me won't necessarily represent the Treasury. So as you wanted me to focus on, if you look at the policies that we are developing to address this issue of inclusiveness, and also what are the challenges ahead of us. So basically, as you know, we have now moved out from Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals. So 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals specifically concentrate on this, addressing this big issue of inclusiveness in the economic growth. So as of the Treasury, agency which formulate most of the policies in the government. So each and every policy formulation we will press for to add the element of inclusiveness. So when we work with the development partners like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, or whatever agency, so we make it very necessary that we have to have some element of inclusiveness to address this big issue. So as my previous speakers mentioned, so we have been able to bring down our poverty index from like 22% in 2002 to nearly 7% by now. But we cannot be complacent. Still, majority of the people are just hanging around this poverty line. As a small economy which is vulnerable to even not only external shock, even a small internal shock like the recent floods, can overnight change these indicators. So we cannot be complacent. We have to do a lot. So from the Treasury, even during last budget, we have implemented a number of policies towards addressing this issue. For example, we have identified one of the potential areas we can address this issue of poverty or social and economic cohesion of the poorer sector in the society is to support SME sector. So we have now in the process of developing loan schemes worth some $200 million specifically focusing this SME sector. Besides that, within those loan schemes, we have set criteria that certain percentage of this loan should go to regions outside Colombo and should go into enterprises headed by women. Likewise, specifically, we are targeting these vulnerable sectors. I think targeting of our policies is very critical in addressing this issue. Then beside that, even in if I talk about my department, which basically involves in government procurement. So even in procurement, we have laid down criteria in the very recent past that when government procures services or goods or some construction, we will give a certain allowance for regional construction agencies. Not big companies in Colombo can go into regions and get everything. So we will facilitate those regional construction agencies to do the work in those areas. Likewise, each and every government policy now we are trying to address this issue. Then if you look at the challenges ahead of us achieving this thing. Basically, I think Dr. Nandalal, the Deputy Governor, will know better than me. We are sitting on a fire like. We have a huge dead stock with us, which is to be exploded in one in 2019 and one in 2021. Like. Besides that, we don't have the fiscal consolidation that is sufficient to spend enough money for this, addressing this issue. In that case, so we have to somehow tackle this first. As our colleague from the World Bank mentioned, there are serious lapses in our tax systems. We still basically depend on indirect taxes, which will badly affect the poorer sector, because when we tax the goods, rich and poor both will pay the equal amount, regardless of the poverty. Even the innocent man in the village has to pay the same as the rich person in Colombo pay for the goods. So we have to move from indirect tax systems to direct tax system. But still there are a lot of resistance. Even as a person which closely work with these agencies, when we try to make changes, when we try to do good things also, there are a lot of inherent resistance which we have to overcome. Besides that, one of the key steps taken by the government, now we have in the process of establishing sustainable development, to handle this sustainable development goals, special agency that is will be a national focal point, and the Department of National Planning at the Treasury also doing a lot of things in this regard. So we are now trying to harmonize our national policies with the policies embedded in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. As of now, around 50% of the SDG indicators we do have in our national policy. So we have to develop another 50% indicators, targets to fall in line with the SDG targets. So we are in the process of developing those with the stakeholders, but there also we have issues, because identify a single stakeholder is not difficult, because all these are cross-cutting. We cannot assign this function, this area to a single ministry. So it's very difficult. But we are doing our best with the assistance of Sustainable Development Ministry and the Department of National Planning and the Treasury to do a lot of things. So at the moment we are doing a lot of things. We are trying our level best to address these issues, and also in the future we have to do a lot. So I think during the discussion we can elaborate more on these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rathnaseela, for this bringing in yet another. The private sector, the gearbox is what the gentlemen who are from the bureaucracy, and the drivers are the politicians, and the passengers are the people. So at the end of the day, it is the passengers who want to be in the bus and be the beneficiaries of the bus. So we have to get this thing going. So it's the engine driver, the engine of the development process. Over to Anushka.
Thank you very much, Indrajit. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you from 11 countries, and especially talk to many of the students of economics in the room. Before I commence, I have to just apologize for having to leave a little early after this. I've told the organizers and the chairman as well, as I have to attend a family emergency. So I hope you'll excuse me after this. I wish I could stay for longer. I'll start with a very quick response to what Dr. Injit his analogy, because I think it will link up to something I'm going to say towards the end of my remarks. And that really is that my firm belief is that the drivers of that bus, I'd rather have it as a super fast, clean energy car like a Tesla, because the bus gives a connotation of something moving slowly, but I agree it carries people. I think Sri Lanka needs a development policy or success in which the drivers are the people, not just passengers who are passively receiving. So just extending that analogy, I hope that will be the case. And I think it will be also good that it is people like Dr. Rathnaseela and others who may be at the gearbox but aren't responsible for slowing down the economy or slowing down people's potential through poor regulation or weak bureaucracy. And it's always comforting when we see people like Dr. Rathnaseela and Dr. Nandalal Weerasingha in government who are very progressive. Going as the last speaker is always hard because a lot of things have already been said. But I think the advantage I have then is that you were able to hear a lot of different perspectives, and mine will nicely plug into that as well. When I asked the organizers what each of us should focus on, they said, this is our topic, speak a few words on this topic. So here is where I'll split my remarks very briefly, my brief remarks into two. One is in the title you can see the phrase paradigm shift. So I'll focus a few thoughts on that. And the second part of this title is inclusive growth, or the first is inclusive growth and then paradigm shift. These are the two areas that I'll anchor my remarks to. Even though the title says paradigm shift, I would argue that this is a time of multiple shifts that are taking place. There are too many to mention. I'd like to focus on just three. The first is a paradigm shift taking place at a global level. And by the way, in my remarks, I'm not going to give you any firm or try to be conclusive and say this is where we are at now, this is how it's going to be. All of you are students. I hope you'll be curious to explore these issues further through your own lens. And all I'll be giving you is a frame through which to think about these issues. So the first paradigm shift, if you will, is at a global level. Dr. Dayan touched on some of these. At a global level, I think you and I will both agree that there is a distinct shift in economic dynamism towards Asia, towards the East, and of course a certain number of countries in particular, but also large regions like Southeast Asia and East Asia of the past, now Southeast Asia. We have to make a distinction here, even though there's been a lot of discussion of a decoupling. Is there a decoupling between the West and the East, between the advanced West and Asia? I don't subscribe to that view. I think now our world is very much interdependent. We can't say that there's a complete decoupling, but certainly there is a distinct shift in economic dynamism towards Asia. We're also seeing a shift to some extent in leadership, economic leadership, where new emerging giants are trying to assert their economic leadership at a time, to some extent, when your traditional economic leaders or leaders of economic institutions or ideas in the West are failing to do so. China trying to take up that mantle, setting up its own institutions to mirror or compete, we don't know which way it will go, those traditional Bretton Woods institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS Bank or New Development Bank, the Silk Road Fund, the Belt and Road Initiative or One Belt, One Road by China, all of these is symptomatic of this shift of economic activity. We have to recognize that there are two big giant economies in this region where this shift is getting anchored to. One is India, one is China. India, one of the fastest growing economies right now, with a lot of very tough reforms being carried out by Modi. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out in terms of growth. But really at the moment, it is proving to be one of the fastest growing economies. China, the biggest capital exporter right now. So all of these bunch of issues are my first point on this paradigm shift taking place at a global level, global economic power shift. The second is a shift in terms of economic ideologies. And again, this Dr. Dayan touched on some aspects of this. There is a huge amount of contestation of economic ideologies, development paradigms taking place now. And it's probably one of the longest periods where we have not been able to see a consensus view emerge on what the right, quote-unquote, right development paradigm should be, or right economic trajectory should be for the world, or indeed for regions. Big questions around, is globalization working? Is it causing more inclusion or more exclusion? Is it working for everybody? Are the benefits being felt by everybody? Anti-globalization rhetoric filtering into the US elections, into the UK elections, and in many countries where there are big questions about globalization. But at the same time, we see how countries, and certainly Sri Lanka has been a huge beneficiary of globalization. So how do we reconcile these two? In terms of the divisions or the inequalities that globalization is supposedly causing, there are two schools of thought, that it's trade that it's causing it. Freer trade, unequal trade. Another school of thought saying, no, it's not trade, it's technology. In economics, many of you would have learned about skill-biased technical change or skill-biased technical progress. Those with higher order skills will benefit more in an era of greater technology use. Those who don't have those skills are going to get left behind. So is it skills and technology that's causing these divides of globalization, or is it simply trade? Then big questions around what is the solution? Is it to deglobalize? Is it to become more protectionist? Is it to develop more skills to tackle the skill-biased technical change? And finally, in this shift of economic ideology, where do we go with trade integration? Should it be unilateral trade liberalization, like what Singapore did? Is it trade integration at a regional level? We all know that SAARC hasn't progressed, ASEAN has progressed to some extent, but now it's not even regional integration, they're talking about mega-regional integration. Like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership being pushed by China, which was a response to the US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership of the TPP. We now don't know which way the TPP is going, but we still have RCEP on the agenda. So again here, different, various shifts taking place in ideas around economic integration, ideas around how economies should, what kind of policy framework they should follow. The third of my three paradigm shifts that I'd like to put forward is closer to home, related to the Sri Lankan economy. As was mentioned by, I think, Ralph and a couple of other speakers, Sri Lanka is now trying to shift from a debt-fueled, public infrastructure-driven economic model, which of course has its natural limits, to one that's driven more by exports and FDI, outward orientation rather than domestic market focus. We've seen the non-tradable sector, construction, consumption, wholesale and retail trade being the dominant growth drivers in the post-war period. And again, that has its natural limits, given that we are a small domestic market of just under 21 million people. So then we're trying to shift to a more tradable sector-driven model. But the tradable sector is not growing. Exports have been performing poorly. Amidst all this, we are having a much needed fiscal consolidation effort under the supervision of an IMF program, where we're trying to bring the budget back on track, because the budget has always been a source of macro instability in Sri Lanka. And we have fiscal consolidation, we have tighter monetary policy, all for macro stability. But of course, there is the other side of that, which is growth. And growth has slowed down to below 5%. In fact, the World Bank in its latest report forecast 4.7% growth for 2017. A few years ago, a study by IMF economists and central bank economists suggested that Sri Lanka's growth potential, or potential rate of growth, was about 6.5%. So clearly we are well below that. So I think we need to, in this shift, towards macroeconomic stability, how do we also create the shift in growth, where growth does not amble along at a sub 5% for too long. My final set of comments on the other part of this title, which is inclusive growth, and here I'll be fairly brief. All I want to say here is that, as Dr. Wijesinha mentioned in his opening remarks, there are a lot of conceptions around this idea of inclusive growth. Various people have various, and you said 5 economists will give 6, maybe I'm throwing in a 7th, maybe it's already covered in that 6. But my interpretation of inclusive growth is not just more people benefiting from growth, or more people, or using a tool like redistribution to help people reap the benefits of growth, but rather more people being able to take part in creating that growth. And this is where you become a passenger on the bus to being a driver on the bus. I think for too long, too many people have seen inclusive growth, and maybe because there's so many different interpretations of it, as this thing where we grow, but then also we do a few good things to make sure there's equity. I'd rather see us using growth in a way that helps more people be part of creating that growth. And this is certainly not trickle down. I'm talking about empowering people to have a fair shot as anyone else in the economy. And this is where economic freedom comes into play. Even if you take, what do I mean by economic freedom? Looking at all our procedures, our processes, our approvers, our doing business to see, does it help SMEs? The economic census done recently shows that out of all industrial establishments, 93% are micro businesses, below 5 employees. If you add small and medium, it's over 99%. So in industrial establishments, we are an MSME economy. So to talk about inclusive growth without talking about the bottom of the pyramid of firms is certainly not inclusive. And this is where I think we need to unleash the potential of that sector, economic freedom in terms of making sure the rules are fair for everyone. Often people think that chambers of commerce like ours, where more often than not we represent the big businesses, care about ease of doing business or improving doing business indicators because it helps them. In fact, the bigger businesses have a better chance of operating in a constrained doing business environment. Who benefits most from improving doing business? Who benefits most from having great economic freedom? It is people and businesses at the bottom of the pyramid. And this is where I'd like to end my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anushka. I think this whole brief presentations brought us to a very interesting atmosphere. I'm sure all of you have questions to ask. Let me just, before I open the forum for questions, let me just make one touch on one point. The discussion had been very much focusing on Sri Lankan experience. For the benefit of our friends from abroad, let me just make some rationality as to why it may be helpful here for a number of reasons. One is Sri Lanka is a paradoxical scenario where we have the kind of equitable economic development, but without growth. And on the other hand, we had a number of periods of our development coming back from plantation era where we had export-driven, growth-driven, but no equity. Then comes to 1940s onwards till about 1970s, we were moving on the other direction. We were trying to be more equitable, but no growth. Then we come to the 1970s onwards, we were trying to drive exports and growth together, but paying little attention to equity, and we got into a disastrous scenario. Then in the 1990s, which Dayan was talking about, a particular president, where he tried to have a hybrid of economic growth, rural development, equity, exports, all in one pack, but that was pretty short-lived because of unfortunate scenarios we had in the background. Then comes another scenario where we were moving again towards on the more moving away from equity. Then comes in the 2000 latter part of 2000 till about 2014, we were driving economic growth after as a post-war economy, where we have a lot of things that have been left out and that had to be rebuilt. So that's where the infrastructure comes in. Then from 2015 onwards, we seem to be moving, as Dayan mentioned, we are quite moving more towards, in a kind of a confused scenario, we are moving towards more neoliberal, more economic growth in a different model. So this is the example, which may be very relevant to many countries who are here and also of subject interest for all of you. So with that little note, let me open up the discussion. And we would like to take questions from the audience. Please, yes. Please, let me just make one quick comment. Please introduce yourself, from which country, if you happen to be coming from a different country, and make your question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is Amir Rahman from Independent University, Bangladesh. My question is that since inclusive growth has become a slogan type, can we revive SARC to make a single agenda and a good platform to take this further? Because SARC is now sleeping, it should be revived. Otherwise, it will become a politically dead. It's in the life support anyway, but if we can actually revive it and make it a single agenda and add with that, that can be a good successful one. Otherwise, regional integrations, I don't see any scope. Is your comment on that?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to take that because I would like to refer you to the Poverty Alleviation Report. For the first time in 1991, when was a new and on poverty alleviation goals, equity goals. And there was an independent commission with the timeline. So that is often forgotten. I would think that the starting point would be to go back to that report. You had some of the most progressive economists and social scientists in the region being brought together. That as kind of an indispensable building block.
Okay, any other? If I add one more point to political thing. Whether SARC does exist as an entity, or whether the SARC could deliver what it's supposed to be delivering for the region, it's Pakistan and India. Until this has been sorted out, the SARC is just an import from many perspectives. Okay. Let me also make another little point to our young budding economists in the background. Don't be overwhelmed by these personalities. That's how the play goes. You should make your own contributions. Don't look at other people. You just make your point. And I think you should do that. Take this opportunity. No question is a stupid question. It's just the attitude that is stupid. Okay? Please go ahead. Thank you. Yep.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Olaimi Bakri. I'm from South Africa. Before coming into Sri Lanka this morning, I thought Sri Lanka was all about cricket and that was it. But having listened to the audience and to the speakers, I was actually very, very, very impressed. The last speaker did mention that about 93% are actually involved in small-scale businesses. From an economic perspective, that kind of implies that people are probably not investing into Sri Lanka. I think when I walked into this country this morning, I saw vast potentials. I saw untapped potentials. Why investors not investing into Sri Lanka? Why? Could you explain briefly?
I guess that's the million-dollar question. Or should I say $500 million question? Because that was the FDI figure for last year. But listen, on a more serious note, I think that's absolutely valid point about investment. And I think there are a lot of questions that need to be asked about why our FDI performance is below what it could be. One observation is that post-war, the pickup in FDI, and there was last 7 years, 6 or 7 years, went into real estate, in tourism, in mixed property development, some of it in energy. So there has been some pickup in foreign investment, but a lot of them have been in domestic market seeking activities, not export-oriented industries or goods or services. So that's probably one observation. Another is, depending on who you ask in Sri Lanka, the question, why aren't we getting more investment? You get a different answer every time. There are issues ranging from uncertainty in tax policy. We've had 2 budgets where a lot of the tax proposals weren't enacted. We have uncertainty around a new Inland Revenue Act that we hope will get some clarity and consistency over the next couple of months. We've had a lot of flip-flopping, non-implementation. So all of this in this bucket of tax policy uncertainty. Another bucket of issues around land. There are difficulties in accessing land. There are lack of transparency in availability, in pricing and ownership of land, and there is also flip-flopping on whether foreigners can own or lease land and what rules that would entail. And I think that from investors who have spoken to us, that is a concern. Then there's a whole bucket of issues related to ease of doing business, and I think that's faced not just by foreign investors, but by domestic investors too, on approvals, on delays in getting approvals, delays in processes. But listen, we had an investor conclave about 2 weeks ago. We had over 120 foreign investors from 25 countries. We surveyed almost all of them and asked them, what are the top factors you consider when investing in Sri Lanka? Their number 1 factor was geographical location. And this is where I think helps us then understand how to target investors, foreign investors, and even inspire local investors to see Sri Lanka for its geographical location, not just to become a tranship, an entrepreneur trade hub like Singapore. We can do a lot more. The other interesting factor is that what do you consider as the most important issue you want in Sri Lanka, and that revolved around rule of law and clarity in policies. So I think that kind of summarizes my thoughts on why we are not seeing investment. But again, if you ask different people, they'll say different things. These are just some thoughts that I have. Yep.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that. My wife and I were in Singapore in 2010. I was a senior visiting fellow at the NUS. And I remember the then Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, who was also the Minister of Defense of Singapore, giving a speech to us. He didn't know that there were Sri Lankans in the audience. And he said, not only is Asia the fastest growing region of the world economy, within Asia, the country with the fastest economic growth outside of China is Sri Lanka, post-war Sri Lanka. and I wrote this up for a newspaper. I was so delighted to hear this. Now, what that tells me is that when the model, the economic growth model of the previous administration was halted and then deviated from by the new administration, that model had not yet exhausted itself. It was registering 7+% growth. Now, of course, growth is not, as we know, the only criterion, but it is an important one. Administrations change. I'm not saying that the administration should have remained and the new one not been elected. But as the Americans say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There were course corrections necessary. There seemed to be a debt overhang, but the previous economic managers say that that was, it was under control. But there was a certain logic in that model. The logic was that local investors, the chambers of commerce, for instance, had been repeatedly asked by that government, what do you need? And the Sri Lankan, the high-performance Sri Lankan businesses had said, better infrastructure. Now, the government of the day invested in better infrastructure, the money coming from the Chinese, who were the only guys with the money, just as, say, in the 70s, early 80s, the only guys with the money were the Japanese. So the Chinese surpluses were tapped into to upgrade drastically public infrastructure. Now that happened. There was another stage envisaged in which FDI would be attracted because now you had the infrastructure to get the stuff from one place to another. Now that model was questioned, criticized, not corrected, but abandoned in favor of something new which is actually old. It's a neoliberal model. So that is my first answer, the first point, that we abandoned a model which had not exhausted itself. Now when we abandoned the closed statist model in 1977, it had exhausted itself. It was low growth, high unemployment. But we abandoned an economic model that was working, that probably needed correction. But the foreign investment didn't flow because there was a logical sequence envisaged, and the sequence was disrupted. The second point is that of political stability. Now, political stability was supposed to be brought about by the so-called unity government, which is a template that is used in Afghanistan and other places by the West. So here you had a bit of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, the centrist party, linked with the main center-right party. But what that did was that it completely disrupted the way the system had functioned for decades. The way the system functioned was that you had a government and you had the opposition, and the opposition provided the feedback loop and was the watchdog. But now, instead of a government which has policy coherence and an opposition which is the government in waiting, you have the contradictions within the government. And that causes freeness of the Constitution will be dropped. That's what we know from the discussions that are going on. So the matrix itself has been called into question. Every serious investor in the world who looks at Sri Lanka knows about it because it's in some of these reports, and some of those reports are sent to me as well by the people who prepare them. And I know that it says, look, we don't know how long these guys are going to last together. We don't know how long this marriage is going to last. And we do not know what this new constitution is about, how the ground is going to change. So how do you expect major FDIs to come in?
Can I?
Yep.
I think that's an important question. One part I want to cover that was not discussed here, why there are no investment happening by the local firms. And if you look at this numbers, 93% are small firms which have below 5 people employed, then if you look at the access to finance, so access to credit by those firms, so for them to invest is very low in Sri Lanka. So even the domestic savings available is not sufficient to have kind of growth for investment. It is about domestic savings is about 25%. We need 30% investment, though there is a gap. Obviously, then foreigners will have to bring in by the government or by the private sector. That is, there's a one gap. So limited savings pool available in Sri Lanka are intermediated for the private sector through the banking system. So if you look at Sri Lankan banking system, private sector credit still 30% of GDP. Compared to some of the East Asian countries where have grown faster, is a proper financial intermediary function will at least need 100% of private sector credit to GDP, so that financial intermediary process going through and to the all levels of the people in the economy. So this 93%, those are the ones who are creating economic activities and growth, but only I would say 10% of those will have easy access to banking system, where whatever the savings available are basically utilized by bigger firms or few sectors like construction, retail and wholesale, whereas the small guys would not have easy access to credit. That is the key factor here, is more financial inclusion, where these people will have easy access to capital so that they can expand. So why that is not there? Say in our system, if a smaller firm would go to a bank and have a credit, either they have a collateral or have some kind of a viable business or something. That's difficult to establish. For them, they remain with limited capital, they don't expand. That is, I think, a reason. To address that, what is needed to be done, for example, a lot of countries, for smaller firms to have access to capital, and you need to have a kind of a credit worthiness assessed, so that without the collateral, one should go to finance institution and have credit at a reasonable rate so that they can expand. I think that is one weakness, one reform that we need to have addressed. Have a more financial inclusion in terms of access to credit by the smaller firms, easy access so that they can expand. That is I think, one area that we need to address.
Actually, to address this issue, as proposed in the budget last year, with the Asian Development Bank, now we are in the process of developing a credit guarantee scheme, where ADB has already agreed to put $100 million. So with the banks which will be cooperating in this regard, so share of that guarantee will be borne by the bank themselves, while the rest will be borne by the government. So now we have referred it to the Attorney General. There are a couple of issues to sort out. Once those are cleared, of course, I think we will be able to introduce that. And at the same time, I think we like it or not, the government itself is partly responsible, because excessive domestic borrowing by the government is crowding out the low credit to the private sector.
And also to add that point, one is that even available credit is absorbed by large state-owned enterprises like CPC, CEB, and also by the government. And these smaller firms, they can't access to external capital. So only the few institutions, like only the government would have easy access to international capital in terms of commercial borrowers or other development agencies. Whereas even our private sector, big corporates are still not having access, or they are reluctant to go out and bring capital. This is where the public-private partnerships and big whatever investments we need to come into the private sector to fill that gap. Otherwise, it's difficult to have this investment need, fulfilled by a limited domestic sector in this country. And there's competition for this limited sector, and that is basically absorbed by two large players, either government or the private sector, so the others are left out.
Okay, yep. Thank you very much, Anushka, for being here. You had to leave. So please go ahead. Let me also make a small comment. We'll try to make the answers as brief as possible so that we can go around answering more questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for the very good discussion. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jayatilleka. I'm a Sri Lankan, but I'm working in UK in Southampton University Business School. I'm not an economist. I'm an accounting lecturer, but I've been working on human capital. That's my research area. So for a couple of years now, I've been working on that. And recently, I was actually invited by Aviva Senior Global Responsible Investment Team and the Living Wage Foundation in UK to do a research around, to do an investment case behind living wage analysis. Okay, so one of the main aim there is they are more interested in how they are going to take care of the labor force. So one point mentioned by Dr. Dayan and Anushka as well, like one is dealing with the inequality, and the other one is like making the passengers drivers in this bus. So that kind of require us to take care of the labor force well. And another problem we have here in Sri Lanka is, like we said, women participation in the labor force is like 30% at the moment. So we need to think what the reason is. Sometimes maybe the opportunity cost of being employed is higher than, not being employed, because as a women we still have some sort of a cultural role to play. Take care of kids, taking care of the family and everything as well. So if they are working, they need to be compensated well to do that as well. So that's another thing we need to address. So these are actually my points. Are we taking care of these aspects? Are we actually thinking about the labor force? Are we treating them well? Because as a human capital researcher, what I'm looking at is, we look at the value creation by firms, and we look at how this value is distributed by the firm. At the moment, there is actually a huge gap in between the way it's created and the way it's distributed. So what sort of approaches have been taken by the institutional arrangements to deal with these things? Hope my question is clear. The comments I made.
Thank you. Perhaps I will put a question to Ralph.
And I would also like.
Yeah. Let me just make an additional point there. On the one side, the cost of labor, but then at the same time, you're trying to compete in the world market, where you've got to be very competitive. So that's where the labor is on the other side of it. Where you. So over to Ralph first. Ralph, you have something.
Yeah. So first of all, I agree that it's well known that the labor participation of women is very low. Yes.
We're actually looking at the human capital development as part of the economic development and economic growth here. I'm not an economist, but I'm looking at the accounting side of it. So that's the way I see it.
Yeah. There definitely, women have it more difficult measurably more difficult in various economic areas. First of all, you can, if to go onto the line of discussion that from the previous question, access to finance is not only biased against small firms, but also biased against small firms if they're owned by women. So access to finance by women actually is lower than that by men, all else equal. Second of all, the fiscal resource available for women to participate maybe could be improved, and that's actually a very important part, because if you think about living into retirement and avoiding old age poverty in the private sector, you need to have built up your pension fund, and if you retire early, or you leave the labor force early, you don't build up enough. So there are all sorts of reasons why we think labor force participation by women should be encouraged. It also should be, in a way, it's an untapped pool of labor. I think by now there are more women in university and schools than men. So it's a waste of resources. Now, from a kind of macroeconomic perspective, it also makes a lot of sense because if your labor force is going to project to shrink, let's say about 10 years from now, that's assuming that labor force participation more or less stays the same. But there's a very large untapped labor pool. That's just the women who don't participate in the labor market. It's early retirement. It's, as Dr. Nandalal said, the 30% of the labor force who works in the agricultural sector who don't make enough money, and the 1 million Sri Lankans abroad. So also from in that perspective, it's women who don't participate in the labor force. It's also a big pool of unused labor, so I fully agree with that. I wouldn't be able to give, apart from agreeing, there's some policies I can think of, but a lot more needs to be done. And yeah, we hope that the government has some ideas about it.
I think it's a very valid point, but I think it also has to do with perspective. Now, do you take the labor force merely as a factor? Or is the well-being of the labor force and the terms and conditions of its insertion, its participation, a goal of policy? Now, when I was elected chairperson of the ILO in Geneva, I was lucky to work with the Director General Juan Somavia, Chilean, and at the time the ILO put forward the slogan of decent work. Now, decent work was not just a phrase. There were so many points or measurements of what constituted decent work. Now, decent work is something that should be taken as a goal of policy. But it's not a goal of policy in Sri Lanka anymore. Actually, we used to have an economic philosophy in which human development was a conscious goal. In fact, some of our thinkers like Dr. Jayatilleka, a development thinker who is still alive, there's a new book that has been put out of his writings. They were part of the global shift from pure growth to human development, which you found in the UNDP reports and so on. But now I don't hear that anymore. It may be existing within the bureaucracy, but not at the level of our top politicians and policymakers. But I do believe that decent work, which includes gender equity and the participation of women, the full participation of women, the facilitation of the full participation of women, the empowerment of women, that has to be built back as a major goal, objective of economic policy. And I'm afraid that is not, it does not seem to me from the economic discourse, the finance minister's new speeches, the prime minister's speech, the CCEM, the work that they do. I don't see decent work and the well-being of the labor force being a goal of policy. But I did experience this again during the Premadasa presidency, where one of the conditions for state banks to give loans for the 200 garment factories program, which was export-led industrialization, was that the factories had to be air-conditioned, the meals had to be provided, and these were mainly women who were working in the garment factories, and the status of the women was ensured. This was during that period. But now I don't see that as a major goal of policy.
Yeah, actually, as Professor Dayan correctly mentioned,
Dr. Dayan, not
Dr. Sorry, this decent employment is actually a goal under sustainable development agenda. I think it's 11th goal of the SDGs. So government has, I think, accepted that as a major goal to be achieved, and in the process of developing the indicators towards that.
Which government? You know why I'm saying that? It sounds like a joke, but there is the Sustainable Development Agenda, which President Sirisena is committed to, and he was present at the big launch and the exhibition and so on. And you have the new finance minister, Mr. Mangala Samarveera, who addressed the Ceylon Chambers of Commerce. That was the first major speech he made. And he said that the blueprint for the economic development is the Prime Minister's speech. Now, the Prime Minister's speech doesn't include this at all. So that's why I said which government, because there are two economic philosophies competing or coexisting within the same administration.
Yeah, we are trying our level best to harmonize these two.
For those delegates from abroad, probably might get insights to some of the unspoken reasons that are holding us back from becoming one of the growth success stories or inclusive growth success stories in South Asia. It's not, it's known history. In 1965, Sri Lanka had a per capita growth, per capita income ahead of South Korea. And now you know where South Korea is, where we are, is a classic example of how one can get things wrong. I would like, yes. You can see.
My name is Weerasingha from University of Sri Jayewardenepura. Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I wanted to find out why the Gini coefficient failed in general or failed in Sri Lanka.
Gini coefficient failed in maybe more statistics.
First of all, so the Gini coefficient fell, so inequality, the measure of inequality, so I always get confused which way the Gini goes, but it's a coefficient of inequality, so yeah. It fell in the 2000s, 2002, to the end, basically to the end of the war, and then it rose for the next few years, post-war, the Gini coefficient actually rose. Now it's a bit speculative for us to understand why inequality rose in the post-war years. It seemed it could have been the drivers of the economy. For example, it became very much construction and domestic non-tradables-led growth. It could be that commodity prices, which were very high, rising just until about 2000, well, the collapse in 2008. They kind of went up and down post-war, which could have also had an impact on the income of the poorest. As I said, it could have been that the growth model post-war, which had a high growth rate, benefited maybe the richer segments of society. It's difficult to unearth. It's more based on correlation, and for me, it's also a bit speculative. But that's all I can say about it. I don't know if maybe those who were there in those years, I've only been there for 2.5 years, maybe can explain.
Nandalal, do you have anything to add?
No, this is, I think, Gini coefficient changed very marginally. I mean, I don't see a significant, movement in downward or upward. So it's basically a reflection of income inequality that we have seen, and faster growth. Obviously, at the beginning of the high growth, the benefits would firstly the system trickle down to the high income group, and then it will take some time to grow it further down unless the government comes back and implement kind of redistribution policy in terms of taxes and subsidies. So that has not happened. So that's a natural growth trickling down first into high income. And we have seen a post-war, there was a relatively high growth, as Dr. Dayan mentioned, and that obviously seems to be benefited more into high income and not going at trickling down to the lowest income in terms of either redistribution by the government or in terms of natural trickling down to the low income. So that is a natural process. I don't see, unless the government specifically targets redistribution policy in terms of high income taxes, lower indirect taxes, so that redistribution can be addressed on a gradual basis. Otherwise, this is a natural process. I don't see. You need to have a policies to address that kind of Gini coefficient. It's difficult for any country to improve the Gini coefficient in a short period of time.
I would like more questions from the audience. Yes. Mike, please begin.
Hi, I'm Rehan. I'm a youth entrepreneur. I run a small company called Media Geography and Digital Content. So I'm looking at this whole scenario from a media perspective, because no matter what you say, the change should come from the people. It's driven by the people. So I heard from investor in the public sector that compared to a Sri Lankan construction work and a Chinese construction worker, it says Chinese construction work is 5 times more expensive than the Sri Lankan construction worker, but 8 times more productive. And I heard from another Uber, similar product, Uber picked me here, that the average, like if a 3-wheel driver has potential to earn about 100,000 per month. But it seems that 98% of the pick me drivers turn off their meter when they reach the average day sales. So I don't know, some call it island mentality, some call it motivation, could be to several cultural or Buddhism could play a role in it. I just want to know what should be the message in general, get the goal, get the motivation, what should we communicate to the people for them to kind of get this, that we need to reach high standards, we need to go as a country, what kind of attitude do we need to inculcate? So my question.
It's a fairly broad question.
Like, I can take that. Well, I think the only thing that works is a combination of 2 things. One, a philosophy and a model that doesn't separate the people from the country. I mean, you can't say, look, guys, you work harder, it's good for the country. It has to be the case that there is a tangible benefit for the people. People are incentivized not by but by tangible gains. Now, as Dr. Aponso confirmed, for a brief period, which was interrupted because of an assassination, you saw in Sri Lanka, and I saw this up close, you had the following things which were supposed to be impossible to do at one time, actually happening at the same time. You had high performance in the stock market, you had foreign investment coming in, you had the Gini coefficient improving because there was a transfer of real incomes to the poorest of the poor. You had massive welfare programs. You had free meals, midday meals, free school uniforms which have been cut back by this government. It was initiated by a UNP government. The fabrics came from China. You had the 200 garment factories program. So you had a transfer of real incomes, but you also had higher growth, and you had foreign direct investment, and you had a more active stock market. So the model, I think, was working. And you need a model which can incentivize the people by proving that they benefit in the here and now. And you don't have that. I said 2 factors. The second factor is example. If you have a leader who's hardworking, hands-on, who has a very good management style, and who has a proven track record of success, and I won't name, but I can think of one person when I look around Colombo, then you would find others emulating that, because it trickles down. Don't forget that the Sri Lankans did something that was thought impossible. The United States has been fighting in Afghanistan for 16 years, it hasn't won. But Sri Lanka managed to mobilize itself and beat one of the most powerful, possibly even the most powerful at that time, terrorist movement, which had an Air Force, Navy, suicide bombers. So it's possible to harness that energy, not only for war, but for positive, constructive goals. But it requires the management style you had during wartime. You got the most committed elements in the right place. And then in 3 years, you did what people couldn't do or leaders couldn't do for 27 years before that. So I think it's perfectly possible. You have the right model, and you have the right people in the right place, it can be done.
I just want to add a point to perhaps give the discussion slightly to another perspective. Sri Lankan society is burdened with heavy indirect taxes, which means even though you earn money, at the end of the day, you have very little to spend. Very little. So because of that, there's a discouraging factor. How hard work you are does not give the kind of level of improvement and that particular aspect must be hitting us in both ways, on the equity and on growth side. Anything you like to add?
Yeah, exactly correct, I think. If you take a telephone bill nowadays, maybe nearly 50% you pay as taxes. So indirect taxes, I think, affecting in numerous ways, like a country which is importing 99% of the raw materials, even setting up small industries badly affected, because there's inbuilt cost for each entrepreneur at the point of starting business. So how they compete with the competitors in the rest of the world. So we are at a very disadvantaged position because of this indirect tax system in our country. So somehow I think we have to move from this to direct taxes, so which is very difficult, but somehow we have to implement. And then again, not having proper trade facilitation, that also badly affected. So we have some 150 years old ordinance which is mainly focuses on enforcement rather than facilitation. So for example, a couple of years back I could visit Singapore port. They are taking only 7 seconds to process a custom declaration, whereas we take about 1 or 2 days. We still have to, we say it is automated, but still you have to submit hard copies as well. So we have to switch, we have to have single window. For the namesake we do have things, but they are not really happening. So even the entrepreneurs are discouraged.
At the same time, Sri Lanka also be proud of the fact that if you want to take a three-wheeler, it takes just 2 minutes, not even 2 minutes. On that side, we have certain positives which are not being worked out in our beneficial way. Well, I have been told that time limit is 6:15. We have hit 6:20. I'm still trying to see whether there is another question or two that we can pick up. Yes.
Hi, my name is Naushad, and I manufacture handloom shoes. And in terms of how you guys talked about industries being small scale, right? So what we work with is all small, like manufacturing outlets where they have like 10 or 3 employees, for example. But then again, for us, what we try to do is make a product that is contemporary, that can be sold outside of their village towns, so that they can sell for a higher price. So that was our goal. And then I came to the conclusion.
Why our export-oriented industries, if you look at garment, tea, a lot of industries, the worker in those industries, their relative wage is very low compared to the domestically oriented services or other businesses. This is where the export-oriented business is not picking up because they are not competitive enough. This is where I think I heard somewhere the professor, our professor here was helping the government to develop policies that trying to find industries where the worker can earn at least $500 per month income. This is where in Vietnam or in a lot of other countries, why export-oriented businesses are booming. This is where the industries where the worker can earn export-oriented industry worker should be able to earn a higher wage than domestic-oriented business. That is the incentive for the labor force to move into export-oriented businesses. Right now, in existing export structure, export industry, we don't have that. Unless this is where we need to find new sectors. One example is easy. The hanging fruit is a tourism industry where they easily you can have people employed earn about $300, $400 per month. If that is expanded into regional areas, that's one example. Likewise, we need to have that kind of new sectors which can generate higher per capita income, like what you said, the even income. If you can create small firms, they can earn, employee can earn $500, then obviously there will be a lot of people coming into that area. But why that is not coming, they have incentives for them to do some other three-wheeler guy can earn probably more than that. So there's no right, the incentive was right mechanism for them to shift their domestic-oriented work, employment into export-oriented from there. I think this is where the structural issue that we have to address.
But just give me a minute. I'm just trying to take that point of this. I'm just trying to understand what you said. My son every 2 weeks imports something from eBay, Alibaba, I guess you're trying to say something like that?
Right. Like, say for an example.
Just not exporting. But
yeah, so in terms of exporting, okay, I understand it's easy to get to that point. But what I'm saying is now there is a culture of, sustainable products. There are products that people like to buy that are more cost-oriented. And what we are trying to do is, create that and connect them directly with the customer, which will generate more income, like you said, which will encourage them. But there are certain policies in the country that is not encouraging. That's what I'm saying. Like, if we encourage that, if we get the right people to get the product to the direct customer, the labor force is also going to get encouraged in that sense. So why aren't we doing that is my question. Like, technology is available. We need to implement it locally and mid-level. I think it's not being done here. It's unfortunately discouraging people, more or less.
Can I comment on that? There was an economic thinker, unorthodox thinker called Hernando de Soto, who wrote a book called The Other Path. He was a Peruvian. And his main argument was that A, the informal sector, B, the SMEs are a tremendous source of economic energy. And what you need to do is facilitate that sector. Now, during the period that I've been referring to repeatedly this evening, the Premadasa period, Hernando de Soto was brought down to Sri Lanka. Those of you in the central bank would remember. And he in fact addressed the officials, because you had a presidency that was very keen on liberalizing, on cutting back the red tape, on unleashing small and medium entrepreneurs. So you actually got this Peruvian intellectual to come to Sri Lanka and give this speech. But now we do not have that mindset. During that same period, you had a very strong chamber called the National Chamber of Commerce, headed by Patrick Amarasinghe. He is dead now. But that was a time when, apart from the Ceylon chambers, you had the SMEs asserting themselves in a very robust way under Patrick Amarasinghe's leadership. It's all to do with where you're coming from, whether you care enough. But if you have an economic philosophy that, hey, look, I don't care about these small and medium industry guys and these informals and so on, because I'm going to sell off Trincomalee and I'm going to, work with the big boys, and I'm going to sell off Hambantota, and I'm going to give the new terminal of the port, and then I'm going to get the money, and that, So, but if you say, I'm not going to do certain things, I'm not going to sell off strategic national assets, then you have to be creative. And you have to unleash the energies, the entrepreneurial skills of young entrepreneurs who are in the small and medium sector. So it's all to do with what you think and what you feel. That's my answer. We have seen it happen in Sri Lanka in the 90s.
Time is catching up. Unless I can take one more question. We've got to be very, very brief.
end. My question is about the link between corruption and the economic development. As Dr. Dayan mentioned, towards the end of the war, within 3 years, we did it. Somehow the country did it. So maybe we need another 3 years without corruption in the same speed to develop the country and reach that goal as well. What is your view on that, please?
Yeah, my view is that, and all of this stuff you're talking about, but you are about to have a far worse situation. It's not because of people, but because of wrong ideas. Everything that we've been talking about here is going to get worse. Why is it going to get worse? Because our economy has been functioning in a certain matrix. The former finance minister, Sri Jayewardenepura, quite rightly said, I mean, I'm no huge fan of his, but I respect him. He quite rightly said that in Sri Lanka, for there to be sustainable economic growth, high economic growth, you need what he called a strong and stable executive free from the whims and fancies of the legislature. That's why he created the elected executive presidency. And the high growth that we had, though it was interrupted by the war, was entirely during the period of this executive presidency. Different presidents, but we had this institutional framework. As you know, in Britain now, I mean, the government is hanging by a thread. Imagine if you had that situation here, and you had to be dependent on this or that small party for a majority. Economic policy changes. But if you have the executive presidency, you have a measure of stability. Now we are planning to abolish it. The consequences for economic policy planning, economic policy making, for the stability needed for all of what we've been talking about, the consequences are going to be disastrous. You smash the executive presidency, you bring decision-making power back to a parliament that can be bought and sold, and that is volatile. And then you smash the unitary state framework and you parcel out economic powers to the various provinces, which will then function very unevenly. You sell off national assets in a way that Singapore never does, Malaysia never does, no East Asian country has done. And you are looking at a looming disaster.
Okay, thank you. And we come to the end of the discussion. I would like to give 1 minute summary from each one of the panelists here. Make it just 1 minute. Okay, Ralph.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think, thanks for the questions, and also for me, I mean, just to say, I'm here only for a few years as a World Bank staff, so but I have been very impressed by the questions, but also by the panelists with a very long and deep knowledge of the history. So it's been I learned a lot. Thank you very much.
Right.
Do's and don'ts, that's it. 1, don't smash the executive presidency, don't smash the unitary state and devolve excessive economic power, including on lands, to the provinces, because those guys, wherever they are, will sell it off to whoever they want. And the do is look back at how we did something that's hardly ever done. We won that war. Pick the guys who did that right and use that style of management to turn Sri Lanka into a Malaysia or South Korea. It can be done. Thank you.
I mean, if I talk about this topic, inclusive economic growth, rethinking development process in a time of paradigm shift, obviously we discussed a lot of structural issues. Here the challenge for any government is to implement politically difficult structural reforms and get those reforms implemented. Then obviously we will be in a different paradigm. So here the challenge is that whether any government would have a strong political will to implement all difficult structural reforms in the labor markets, in the product markets, all the markets, and how to get the female labor force into work. What are the reforms we need to implement, and how to have more economic opportunities in the regions. what are the difficult reforms. Unless we implement all these reforms, we won't be addressing this the issue of equity, inequitable growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dayan. So what I feel is that to address most of the issues, including the inclusive growth and the general growth of the country, we must give the private sector full support assistance. We say the private sector is the engine of growth, but genuinely whether we are supporting the private sector is the big question. So now, for example, we do have the biggest per capita public sector in the world. We recruit the very talented young graduates and doing nothing. Then private sector is short of skilled people. So genuinely we must support the private sector, and genuinely we must make the private sector engine of the growth. Government should be a regulator and the facilitator, then the country will automatically grow.
Thank you very much, and it's a very in-depth, very broad, very diverse discussion on economic growth, inclusive economic growth, and how it relates to a case study like Sri Lanka for the benefit of Sri Lankans, and also for all those who have come from other countries to see how things have failed despite the fact that there are a lot of things on the table. So it is for the benefit of those undergraduates who are there in the background, you would see this whole discussion has two words: growth pace and growth pattern. So unless you get both right, you have a serious issue. But last but not least, unless you make the cake bigger, you can't cut the cake. You cut the cake, but then each one will be getting a smaller and smaller piece. So it's equally important that you create the economic growth, and with the right professional approach, human development, right policies, and right environment, and right attitudes, and right political vision, then we are on for a change, a paradigm shift. And with that, let me thank Mr. Ralph from the World Bank, Dr. Dayan from a freelancer, and Dr. Nandalal from the Central Bank, and Mr. Rathnaseela, and our Anushka, who had to leave early, and also being in the audience and asking a lot of questions, and also some of the of my students who are sitting watching the whole thing. But I'm sure you should have more questions to ask as we go along. So with that, let me thank all of you, and good night. And I'm sure there must be some other rituals to take place, so you will take it over. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rajesh.